Book 2. Chapter 2. Harper. July 29th, Tunisia, Mediterranean. The southern, barren lands of Tunisia were under the control of Islamic extremists. Here, ISIS militants, who could do whatever they wanted, set up a slave market at night to sell their new wares. Women and children, completely naked and ravaged by the sun, humiliation, lack of food, thirst and constant rape, were brought up to the wooden platform one by one and sold to buyers. The small courtyard where the sale took place was surrounded by armed ISIS guards. The small group of 20 people who crossed the street at the entrance to the courtyard were 3 blocks from the slave market when they arrived at 10 Mahal Street. The town they were in was a labyrinth of narrow and tangled streets, full of interconnected concrete buildings. The militants, who had posted 2 guards at the entrance of the building, entered the 3-story apartment building. The 8 people who arrived in the 6th apartment were so confident that they did not even care to be quiet. All of them had grown beards as they saw fit according to Islamic customs. The man in front said, "Remember, we are looking for a stone disc. There are writings on it. Cut off the head of the American infidel who takes it," and warned again. Nothing should happen to the stone disc. Some were carrying AK-47s, some were carrying GEs. One of the men in the back nudged the other one, laughing. The younger militant took his cell phone out of his pocket and started recording, while the other pulled out his machete from the holster on his back. The ISIS members who were pounding on the door with their rifle butts laughed among themselves, and one said, "Allahu Akbar." This caused the others to shout as well. Their courage had increased with the slogans they were chanting to themselves. So they started kicking the door of the apartment building, which was just as old as the old one, whose paint was peeling off. However, none of them heard the metallic winding sound coming from behind their door because of the noise they were making. Suddenly, AK-47 fire from behind the door caused the 4 ISIS members outside the door to collapse to the ground in the dust that rose from them. While the others, panicking, ran down the stairs to the floor below, the door opened and a hand extended through the narrow gap and threw 2 grenades with the pins drawn down the stairs. The militants who tried to escape screamed and fell to the ground in the explosion. Most of them were unable to move. Blood was coming from the noses, ears and eye sockets of the pack of Islamic extremist killers lying in the dust clouds. This was one of the side effects of the pressure exerted by the explosives used at close range. A few of them saw the door they had kicked open and the man coming towards them. But none of them were in a position to escape. Those who could speak begged for mercy as they had once been treated. However, the person who passed by them showed no mercy as they had done before, shooting them one by one in the head with a gun in his hand. The man who went downstairs did the same to the guards at the gate without hesitation and went out into the main street. The man in a military coat wore earth-colored trousers with side pockets and combat boots. His hair was cut short, his beard was 4 or 5 fingers long. He wore old sunglasses, and a Middle Eastern-style scarf was wrapped around his neck. He had an AK-47 and an old backpack on his back. His relaxed demeanor did not attract any attention among the militants and mercenaries on the street. He took an old-fashioned phone from the pocket of his faded khaki coat and called the number he called Mother and waited for it to ring. When the phone finally answered, there was an electronic tone of an answering machine. The man in sunglasses dialed 4587 and hung up the phone before throwing it in the trash. A computer connected to the answering machine in New York worked with the signal coming to the answering machine and alerted its operator. The operator looked at the incoming code and immediately sent a message to his manager who was dealing with North Africa. The message content was short and to the point. Harper has been exposed. July 29th. 10,000 mt altitude, Adriatic Sea. "Are we going to America?" said the woman in black leather, sitting on the cream-colored recliner, writhing in her seat as supple as a snake. From her window, she could see the Adriatic Sea among the clouds. "Yes," Polanov said sternly. He was a tall, thin man, athletic-looking. He had mohawk hair pulled back with leather fingerless gloves. He was wearing a green camouflage military parka and a hooded sweatshirt, old denim underneath, boots sticking out of his legs. A deep scar from the left forehead to the chin was dark on his long face. His white left eye was visible behind his sunglasses. His arched nose was at a right angle, and his strong jaw gave him a cruel expression. His private jet, which had a 12-passenger seat, had just taken off. There were 2 personal guards and 2 magicians on board. The Bombardier Global Express 9000 model jet, with a gray body and blue wings, had almost every desire of every passenger taken into account. There was even a bedroom and a shower in the rear cabin of the plane. With extra fuel tanks, which were not included in regular commercial flights, this plane would fly all the way to America without stopping anywhere. The woman in leather in front of him was Nadia Perlanova. The woman, who had her blonde short hair done in a showy way, resembled a goddess with her regular, angular face, large almond-shaped blue eyes, and smooth white skin. There was always a sarcastic smile on her full, shapely lips. Under the shiny leather trousers that hugged her long and shapely legs, she had high-heeled boots with pointed toes that ended below her knees. Perlanova was wearing a latex shirt. The buttons on the shirt were so tight that they were almost bursting open. However, Perlanova was one of the rare people who could see the danger beneath this extreme attractiveness. Perlanova was one of the skilled assassins frequently used by the Russian mafia. Under her long-skirted leather jacket, the holsters of 2 pistols that passed over the shoulders of her shirt were barely visible. Perlanova had seen the woman enter into conflicts without even blinking and destroy families in a few seconds. Perlanova looked at the 2 sorcerers behind Perlanova. Sergei Guthrov was a Russian. The man, with red hair and dark blue eyes, was short and thin. His long, thin face looked narrow and gaunt. A thick silver chain was between his short fingers. The man, who had been turning him around nervously, looked nervously out the airplane window again. The man, who had always said he didn't like flying, was also wearing a camouflage jacket like Perlanova. He had a turtleneck sweater underneath. The sweater showed the Kevlar vest he always wore. Guthrov carried a Glock 19 behind his waist. But the man's magic power was far beyond that weapon. Perlanova was sure that if they let Sergei go, he could find a way to destroy a city with magic in a few years. The man sitting across from Sergei was a Hungarian named Andrei. No one knew anything about the tall man, whose short, dark hair was never combed and whose eyes were half closed, except his name. Perlanova was always careful about the men he was given. Perlanova, who first learned everything about them and made sure they kept no secrets from him, knew nothing about Andrei. One day, he decided to force Andrei to talk and tried to confront him, and that day Sergei grabbed his arm for the first time and warned him. Sergei was a fearless, often reckless person who always followed orders. He believed that magic was the end of human evolution and that those who could do magic were superior with this theory. According to Sergei, those who did magic should rule the world. But they were only hunted. Because of this, he had accumulated incredible anger and hatred inside him. Sergei's ruthlessness towards his enemies sometimes frightened even Perlanova. Sergei, who had no respect for his opponents and often despised them, had said to Perlanova, "If you mess with him, you won't see the dawn." This had never happened again. One sorcerer could sense another's energy. Whenever Perlanova approached Sergei, he always felt goosebumps and became uneasy. But Andrei felt nothing. That was what frightened Perlanova the most. Not feeling anything at all. As Perlanova prepared himself for the long flight and reclined his seat to get ready to sleep, he heard Nadia's voice, which sounded like a cat's purr. "Tell me, why are you here?" "For the final victory," Perlanova growled, his voice flat and devoid of conviction. The woman snickered. "You don't strike me as the wizard's savior on a white horse. When you look more closely, you will understand how fragile my heart is." "Those words hurt me very much," Perlanova said, imitating the woman's tone, wrapping himself in his jacket and looking for a comfortable position on the couch to sleep. "It was great," Nadia said with a smile. Perlanova just pursed his lips and went to sleep. He would need all his energy when he got to America. July 29, Thornwood, New York, USA. The Foundation. While Scott appeared to be quite relaxed while riding in the luxury car, the situation was quite the opposite. Noticing this, Otto smiled and said sincerely, "Don't worry, young man. You will be staying there for 3 years, during which time you can come into the city at least once a week, and you can contact any friends and family you have, as long as you don't cross the borders." "Boundaries?" Scott asked, taking his eyes off the road. "Of course," Otto said, looking at Scott through wrinkled lids with eyes as bright as blue diamonds. "If everyone had unlimited phone access, there would inevitably be some problems at the Foundation, wouldn't there? Besides, it's only a matter of time before the detective after you gets a court order for your phone records." "I don't know what you're talking about," Scott said, looking at Otto again, but his gaze showed that he was beginning to reassess Otto. "Detective Kowalski is a detail that should not be forgotten, Scott. Don't make that mistake," Otto said with a smile that deepened the wrinkles on his face. Scott began to wonder how much Otto knew. "Did he threaten you with your mother?" Otto asked casually, pouring himself a whiskey from the minibar in his car. "I mean, the first raid. Did you have Kowalski's gun on your back when you led the Icemen to the drug warehouse?" Scott held his breath for a moment, clenched his fists, and then said through clenched teeth, "Who are you?" "Did you really think I would let a fox blindfolded into my henhouse, Scott Donovan? Or should I call you General?" Otto whispered loudly and with pleasure, sipping his whiskey. About 3 months ago. Ernesto was in the warehouse with 15 men, Fabio Guerra with 6, Cesar Loxio with 8, Silvio with 5. Scott, standing next to the red couch, said, "From now on, everyone will get an equal share, an equal risk. This is the last time we will meet with you. From now on, every plan will come to you as I told you before. We will no longer take the money from the stores, but we will not throw them into the arms of other gangs either," in a voice as hard as steel. These were not ideas that could be put to a vote or plans that could be discussed. "What do we get out of this?" Ernesto's lieutenant, Ricardo Valdez, asked, the disdain in his voice the reason many gang members reached for their guns. But Scott didn't care. "The shopkeepers will protect those who protect them for nothing. The few pennies you get from the shops will only get you to the rope. I'll take you to Manhattan in a suit in 2 or 3 years," he said without taking his eyes off Valdez. "And without anyone's dog." Ernesto stood tall, his arms folded across his chest. "Nice dreams, General. But these men have families. How will they feed them?" he asked. His tone was almost identical to Valdez's. It was a question filled with both contempt and realism. Scott had foreseen this question and its answer. He pulled a sports bag from under the red seat and threw it in front of Ernesto. The man curiously opened the bag and looked at Scott in surprise when he saw the bundles of euros inside. Scott leaned back in the seat and said, "It covers 3 months' income for every man here, doesn't it? Of course, in equal shares. If after 3 months the plans and orders you receive don't take you to a better place, everyone will go their own way." Ernesto then raised his head and looked at his men. All of their faces showed hope for a better life. Few would join the gangs to become real gangsters and crush people's heads in the dark streets. At that Ernesto stood up, clenched his right hand into a fist, and touched his left breast and said, "In that case, we're with you, General." This time, there was a more pronounced respect in his voice than before. About 3 months later. "Your intelligence is dazzling. So why are you so insistent on letting a fox like me into your henhouse?" Scott asked, pulling himself together from his memories. Otto smiled and pointed at Scott with his index finger from the glass he was holding. "That's why. Most of the kids at the Foundation came to campus without knowing their families. They're so far away from the real world. They need someone like you." "A criminal and a murderer?" Scott asked, raising an eyebrow. Otto smiled and said, "If someone shot my brother and father, you wouldn't even want to know what I would do to them. So what you did is within my tolerance, but let's keep it a secret between us. Don't trust anyone on this matter." The Ferguson Foundation was located on a site near the New York City border. Scott had not seen a town or a house on the 40-minute drive. He had read on a sign that they had entered the Foundation grounds 10 minutes earlier. The Foundation campus they finally reached was on a wooded hill. Scott saw a wall running around the hill. As their car approached, the thick wooden doors opened, making the young man think of it as a medieval castle. The building they reached was oriented on a north-south axis. There was a riverbed just to the east, but Scott did not know about it. That did not bother him. He had never been interested in geography, other than his wilderness survival classes. The cream-colored building was made of cut stone. The long, thin windows had white frames made of small squares. The main facade of the 4-story building was 800 feet long. As Scott approached the building, he saw that the main building was shaped like a wide U. Although the 4-story building looked like it was several hundred years old, it was remarkably well maintained. Gargoyles were placed at the corners and on the roof at regular intervals. The car stopped in front of the main building. The young man who followed Otto down examined his surroundings with a keen eye. The entire large area was covered with trees. Many young people, both younger and older than him, were scattered in their own areas of the garden. Some were reading books, some were playing guitar, and some were playing football. Otto, who came up to him, leaned on his cane and said, "The Ferguson Foundation has been around for a long time. We have over 200 branches in North and South America, and each branch has an average of 300 students." "Why?" Scott asked as he approached the old sand-colored stairs. Otto pointed to a young girl sitting on a windowsill reading a book with her cane, and said with an indulgent smile, "Like our founder, I grew up on the streets. Young people with no families should have a chance to live." But Scott didn't believe this old man. He didn't know where or how Otto grew up, but he definitely didn't have any street odor on him. At that moment, a tall, bald man in a suit met them in the middle of the stairs. Otto smiled and said, "Mr. White, just in time. This young gentleman is Mr. Donovan, our newest member of the Foundation. Mr. Donovan, Mr. White, is the director of the Ferguson Foundation Blue Campus." July 29th, Langley, Virginia, USA. Arriving in Operations Room 471, Gail Peterson watched Polanov's actions against SEAL 6 on the plasma screen and asked, "I see you're using your energy wisely. Can anyone come up with a logical explanation for this?" "Besides the Vatican?" Ferguson asked, scratching his chin. "Yeah, except for the wizard stuff," Gail Peterson said, scratching her head. "Every man we could ask has disappeared with 2 guards and millions in bank accounts," Knox said. Remembering 600 scientists on vacation at the same time, Peterson paced around the place, cursing in a manner that earned him admiration from the Marines. Then he pointed to his photograph and asked, "Where's Polanov now?" Ferguson curled his lower lip, tilted his head slightly to the left, and spread his hands out to the sides, saying, "Naturally, he disappeared, boss." "What do we know about Polanov?" Gail asked, turning to Knox with a grunt. "Mercenary, worked for Mossad and CIA," Knox said, gesturing to the operator behind him, bringing Polanov's background onto the screen. "We're using up all the filth in the world?" Ferguson growled through gritted teeth. "Only those who were useful to us," Knox replied. He then spent several years in private security companies. Most of his family was killed in Sarajevo. Gail didn't like this. "Muslim civilians?" she asked. Knox shook his head. "No, it was Serbian militia. They came across our air patrol in a place where they were massacring Muslims." Ferguson raised an eyebrow and asked, "How did we hire Polanov with that background?" The same question must have occurred to Peterson, because he pointed a finger at Ferguson. "He was adopted. The only way we knew about his past was with the assassination of the Pope," Knox said with a shrug. Ferguson raised his eyebrows and said, "Kill our freelancer, the Pope." "Oh my." At that moment, one of the operators said, "Mr. Knox, I have an alert on my screen, sir." "What kind of warning?" Knox asked, clearly unhappy to receive such a vague warning in the middle of an important conversation. "Someone detected Polanov in their facial recognition program," the operator said. While Gale and Ferguson were both paying attention to the operator, Knox leaned over to the screen from behind the man and asked, "What are you talking about?" The operator's screen showed the name of an FBI agent named Peter Andrew. Polanov was identified in a photo he scanned, and the program used jointly by the NSA, FBI, CIA, and DEA had begun to emit warning signals. Knox tapped the young man on the shoulder and said, "Contact the man and get the gist of it." Then he turned to Gale to finish the conversation that had been left unfinished. "What about the scientists?" Gale asked. "They left home with first-class tickets and 2 guards. They went to Cyprus, Israel, Egypt, Turkey, Greece," Knox said, looking at his list. "And then they evaporated." "Who did you put after them?" Gale Peterson asked. "James Bannon in Israel, Brain Turner in Turkey, Georgios Kleiteum Nestra in Greece," Knox said, picking up the files next to him and handing them to Peterson. "Guys with military backgrounds and good records." "I'd pick them too," Gale said, smiling for the first time since she'd entered the room. "What about their credentials?" "I ordered them to do whatever it took to win, sir," Knox said, looking thoughtfully at the screen. "It was a rare decision. Any action by the agent in the field could put both him and the agency in a very difficult position." "You did the right thing," Gale said with a sigh before leaving the room. July 30th, Rome, Italy. "Are we doing the right thing?" Joanna asked with a sigh. Just as Duke had said, they had quickly packed up and gone to the airport. Finding a flight to Rome in the summer was actually harder than chasing news. Nevertheless, Joanna used her charm and Duke his fame to get them a transit ticket to Rome on Airnex. Almost everyone was asleep as the 2-decker A340, with its white and gray interior, flowed through the clouds. Still, the navy blue Airnex stewardesses continued their work with smiles. "What do you mean?" asked the Duke, drinking the brandy that the tall, blonde, and well-groomed stewardess smiled at and held out to him. "I mean, these guys have killed so many people that we know about them, they won't hesitate to kill us too," Joanna said in a fragile voice, looking out the window. "You never know," Duke said. "If we're fast enough, we'll get the word out before it gets to us. Once we go public, we'll be hard to touch." "He didn't save you on that Iraq story," Joanna said curtly, as if to avenge his hurt feelings. Duke sank back into his chair, all his joy gone, and Joanna bit her lower lip. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way," she said with great regret. But frankly, it would have been better if she had shot Duke in the kidneys with a gun. Duke drank his brandy and said, "It's okay, you said what you wanted to say," in a tone of acceptance. Then he leaned back in his chair. "You can leave this story whenever you want, Joanna Swanson. We're journalists, we work to tell the story as impartially as possible, and we get paid for it. If we don't do our job properly, people will eventually lose trust in us and the balance will be disrupted. Then the government and the corporations, the people with power, will use their power to exploit. No one will see or hear the victims. We have to be their leverage, their eyes and ears for a fair accounting. Of course, in time, you will encounter poor people who have been bought by the government, the corporations, the parties or other moneyed powers. They will be more comfortable and richer than you. You will have had it harder, more tired and more battered. They will not have paid as much as you have. But Joe, people will trust your news. They will be the writers, you will be the journalists. You may be scared, little one. You should be afraid, otherwise you'd just be an idiot. Remember, bravery isn't the absence of fear. Bravery is fighting for what you know is right, despite your fears. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm going to get some sleep and think about the price I've paid," he muttered, closing his eyes. Joanna said in a low voice, I'm sorry, but the Duke didn't react." Sighing, the girl looked at the address on her tablet computer again, 6 Via di Porta Pertusa, Rome, Lazio, Italy. She began to wonder with curiosity what kind of surprise awaited her in Italy. Italy was a republic, a country in southern Europe, largely on the Italian peninsula. The 2 largest islands in the Mediterranean, Sicily and Sardinia, were Italian territory. Duke had visited both islands once in a series of articles on the lives of merchant mariners. Italy had land borders with France, Switzerland, Austria and Slovenia in the Alps to the north. The landing spot was Rome, the capital of Italy. Italy had been home to a wide variety of European civilizations for centuries. While the Etruscans and ancient Romans had made Italy their home, the Renaissance movement had originated in Tuscany, Italy, and spread throughout Europe from there. Rome had been the center of Western civilization for centuries, witnessing the birth of the Baroque style in architecture and long the center of the Catholic Church. Tourists who got off their planes were immersed in this deep history as soon as they set off. Joanna had previously said that she had been to Rome once with her family, yet the girl looked quite carefree, with a faint smile on her face as she looked around in admiration. Italy was cooler than they had expected. The rapidly changing weather conditions of the Mediterranean showed themselves immediately in this country. The overcast sky had cut the light by noon, and by midday it was almost dark. The taxi that had brought them from the airport had brought them to the Roma Palace in the city center and had waited for them at the Duke's request. As soon as the Duke and Joanna had arranged their rooms and left their belongings, they set off for Isabella's address. When the rain, falling in large drops from the rumbling clouds, began to wet the city, the taxi left the city center filled with new buildings behind and entered the hills and the winding streets of the old city. The taxi driver looked again at the paper he had been given and turned around the bend of the wide street. The old three-story building was quite well maintained. The ground floor was made of concrete shaped like hard-cornered stone and was gray. The upper two floors were painted yellow except for the gray windows and balconies. Above the thin and high double-winged door were frescoes of bearded male heads on diagonal corners. Behind the wide road in front of the building, which was divided into terraces due to the slope of the land, were the high walls of the Vatican. The walls were covered with ivy. These high city walls also formed the border of a country. The Vatican was an independent country. The Vatican, like San Marino, was squeezed into the peninsular lands of Italy. This was called an enclave. In other words, they were countries completely surrounded by another country. As the rain became increasingly heavy, the soaked couple ran to the entrance of the marble-stepped building, and the old wooden door opened. A pizza deliveryman pulled up on his bike in front of the door, and Duke and Joanna entered the building. The old building had high ceilings. For a moment, the apartment was lit by a white, flickering, dim light, and the echoing sound of thunder filled the building. Startled, Joanna hugged Duke. Duke was surprised by the young woman's sudden action. Pulling herself together, the young woman said, "I'm afraid of thunder." "I mean, I'm not, but I was a little startled." "We got in just in time, it's almost a storm," Duke said, looking out the door. Isabella Feliuoxi was in her late 30s, dark and wheat-colored. Her thick hair had a lot of gray on the sides. The woman, who was almost Duke's height, was quite thin. She wore round-shaped horn-rimmed glasses as if to enhance her oval face. She had a scarf on her head. She was wearing a lumberjack shirt and high-waisted, loose denim pants that were almost falling off her. She said, "See?" to the wet couple who were looking at her in surprise. Isabella was busy cleaning her house just before the sudden rain. The woman, who opened the door with curiosity, was quite surprised to see two wet strangers in front of her. "Signora Isabella? Isabella Feliuoxi?" the Duke said in terrible Italian. "Yes, Duke Perry?" the woman asked in good English, raising one eyebrow. Duke let out the breath he was holding and said, "Yes, ma'am, we spoke on the phone." The woman came out from behind the door where she was half hiding, and motioned with her hand for them to come in. "Please come in. I was expecting you tomorrow. I thought you would rest tonight," she said, speaking quickly, as befits an Italian. "I am afraid we shall not have that much time, Signora," said the Duke, smiling. "Isabella, please, I'm sorry about my outfit." "I was cleaning the house," Isabella said, smiling. Then, seeing that they were still standing in the hallway, she beckoned them in with her eyebrows raised in sympathetic panic. Please come in. Come into the living room." The old house on the top floor had high ceilings with arched doors. The interior of the house, which was dark because of the storm, was furnished with antique furniture but was plainly furnished. There were old but comfortable sofas on either side of the living room. There were large windows on the side facing the front door. Next to one of the windows was a large wooden table. On the table were many old books. Smiling at the guests he had welcomed into the living room, he said, "I have some wonderful wine, and of course tea and filter coffee too." The Duke turned to the woman with a smile. "We are in Italy, Isabella, and I don't want to waste this short time with coffee or tea." Isabella turned to Joanna with a smile. The soaked young woman smiled and pointed to the Duke and said, "I think it's a good idea too." As he waited for Isabella in the kitchen, the Duke realized that he could see the Vatican gardens from the attic. This was a rare thing. Then the view of the garden in front of him seemed so familiar. He was sure he had seen this part of the garden before. As he drank the bittersweet wine Isabella had brought him, he noticed the lines on the floor. The faint lines led to the table leg. Someone had recently moved the table in front of the window. "You have a unique view," he said, smiling. "Just buildings," Isabella said with a shrug and a smile. "Have you ever seen the Pope?" the Duke asked, pointing to the garden with his glass in his hand. "Since the assassination, popes have not been out in the garden much," Isabella said, shaking her head. "Yes," said Duke, going to the next table. There were many old books, and he saw the tripod mark on the table. Someone must have pulled the short-legged tripod over the table and placed it on top. Duke could not help but examine the woman again. Everything was as it should be. Humphrey Braden had always told him, "Everything is as it should be, just take a look." And are there any family photographs? Be suspicious or afraid of what is not there, but never turn away. As Duke looked along the walls and shelves, he noticed that there were indeed no photographs of Isabella. He did not like that at all. As he poured his wine onto the old coffee table, he said, "Isabella, as we spoke on the phone, we are tracking 2 Americans who have gone missing. What was the subject of your conversation when they spoke to you?" Isabella shrugged and sat down on one of the single chairs. They were interested in the First Crusade. More precisely, they were following the trail of a group of knights who had broken away from the main army during the First Crusade. This group in question had landed in Greece and from there they had found ships and gone to Anatolia, she said, supporting the subject with exaggerated movements of her hands. Joanna had drunk half her wine. She looked at Isabella curiously and asked, "Anatolia?" "Mesopotamia," Isabella said, smiling and nodding. Joanna, one eyebrow raised, opened her lips to ask a question, but Duke intervened and said only, "He's talking about Turkey." Joanna nodded to show that she understood. Duke asked curiously, "And did they succeed?" She always loved mysterious historical stories. Isabella's lip curled uncertainly. "I think so. I mean, I looked through the records of the main army after this correspondence, but I didn't see any names of the knights in that column. But then there was one of those who returned home. They crossed the Aegean and came back. We talked about this, and they showed me a map of Greece and asked me where they could cross and where they could land. I marked the settlements that came to mind. And of course, the ports on the Anatolian side." "So where did they go from here?" Duke asked. "Mr. Tanner spoke to the airlines while he was here. They were going to take him to Greece," Isabella said. "I see," said the Duke. "And could you do us one last favor and show us some places in Greece they could go?" he asked. The woman smiled warmly and said, "Of course, if you give me a minute, I'll print out a map of Greece." "What's the symbol on that book?" the Duke asked casually, smiling and pretending to take another sip of wine as he scanned the books on the table, pointing to a symbol on an old book he had picked up. "The coat of arms of the Vatican Guard," she said. For a moment the Duke realized that both Joanna and Isabella were tense. Looking at the crest again, he put his other hand on his chin and asked, "So, do you have this crest on your clothes too?" Isabella shook her head slowly. "Leonardo da Vinci designed the guards' uniforms in part. But yes, when he is on outside business, or when His Holiness goes outside the Vatican, his guards wear jackets with this coat of arms," Isabella said, marking the paper she had printed out of the map of Greece. "I understand, thank you," said Duke, smiling at the paper extended to him. It was still raining outside. The two who got into the taxi that arrived had gotten considerably wet again even in the short distance. He fixed his wet hair and asked, "Why did you ask about that coat of arms?" Said, "I think I only saw it somewhere, but I don't remember," without describing the photo. When they returned to the hotel, the torrential rain had really turned into a storm. The 6-story hotel was newly built. However, its architect had perfectly combined the exaggeration of Baroque architecture with minimalism. The embroidery, which took into account the typical symbols of Baroque architecture, appeared on the wall corners and columns. The plain burgundy curtains were displayed in harmony with the gold color. The burgundy carpets covered the entire floor. The attendant in the burgundy jacket at the magnificent reception, which looked like gold plating, smiled and gave the keys to the couple. As they took the elevator to the 4th floor, the lights in the newly wallpapered hallway began to twinkle. Through the asymmetrical slits of the lights, the white light from outside lengthened the shadows, and the loud thunderclaps made everything seem more dramatic. "What time should we go to dinner?" the Duke asked as he entered his room. He was already standing in the middle of the hallway with his door open. Joanna had opened her door slightly and was smiling with her eyebrows raised from the door to which she had turned her back. "Aren't you mad at me?" she asked cheerfully. "Because of what you said on the plane?" "No, I'm not. What happened happened and what I did hurt my family. I'm not going to hold a grudge against people for that," Duke said dryly, with a half-smile. Joanna bowed her head and said, "I really apologize, I mean." Duke raised his hand and asked, "Neither of us has time for this, Joe. What time shall we eat?" 8 o'clock, said smiling Joanna, with a cheer that filled the entire hallway. Duke entered his room and took off his jacket when the power went out with a loud bang of thunder. Grumbling, Duke threw his wet jacket on the back of the chair when there was a knock on the door. Duke, who had been dreaming of taking a shower, opened the door and found Joanna in front of him. The woman, who had tied her wet hair carelessly behind her head, had let a few strands fall on her face. The woman, whose full breasts and bra were visible through her wet white shirt, had unbuttoned the bottom buttons of her white shirt and tied the bottom part together in a knot. Her muscular belly was visible from the exposed part. The woman, who was pressed close to Duke by the thunder and the flashing lights, said, "I couldn't stand it when the power went out, I really don't like thunder," and leaned over to kiss him. As Duke took the young woman in, he wondered for a moment whether she was really afraid of thunder. The window was open, the curtains were open, the drapes were swaying in the draft from outside. Waking up cold, Duke looked at the open window. Joanna must have opened it, the young woman was still sleeping naked next to him. Seeing the man standing across from the bed in his room, illuminated for a moment by the lightning, Duke had to hold himself back from screaming. He saw the thin, tall figure pointing his silenced gun at him for only a second. The dark shadow turned to the room door, which was broken with a sound like thunder, and pulled the trigger of the gun in his hand. There was a metallic ring. A hole opened in the wall of the short corridor leading to the door. Whatever the man who broke the door had in his hand gave off a sharp, white light for a moment, and then the gunman's chest and back were torn apart by the metallic sounds. Taking a few steps back, the man brushed against the drapes and fell silently out the open window. Then came only the pouring rain and the thunder. Joanna had pulled the sheet over her body in fear and leaned her back against the wall. Two people entered. One was wearing a loose black t-shirt over denim, the other a black shirt. The young man in the shirt had long blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail, was 6 feet tall and athletically built. He wore glasses made of a metal similar to round brass. He gave a few stern hand signals to his dark-haired, short-haired, African-origin friend who was a hand-length shorter and thinner than him. Both were wearing sneakers and carrying backpacks. Both were carrying MP5Ks with silencers. The blonde man had a camera flash on the butt of his gun. The African man approached the window, looked down, and said, "No one will notice him for a while," and picked up the silenced 9mm Beretta from the floor. The light was coming from the corridor behind them. "What's going on? Who are you?" Duke asked. A young man with long blonde hair and round glasses. He put his long, thin finger to his lips and said in a barely audible voice, I'm so sorry to disturb your sleep, Mr. Perry. However, the situation is unfortunately of great urgency. We must unfortunately get you out of the country, the young man said. Then he pointed to the hallway door and said to his other friend, check. Who are you? Duke corrected himself by looking at the other man as he said, you too. Names don't matter, sir. I'm your friend for now, the blond man said, tossing the clothes off the floor toward Duke. And we really don't have much time. Why don't we have much time? He asked as he put on the clothes thrown at him. The blond man picked up Joanna's clothes from the floor and handed them to Duke, slowly turning onto his side. As a journalist, you have the misfortune of asking the right questions to the right people. Unfortunately, it has offended some people. If I cannot get you to the airport immediately and keep you alive until your plane to Greece, I fear you will spend the rest of your journalistic career in an unmarked grave in Italy, he said darkly. I suppose you wouldn't be upset if I didn't believe you, would you? Said the Duke, fully dressed, as he helped Joanna dress. The African man signaled that the hallway was clear. The blond young man nodded at him and shrugged at Duke's words. I suppose your being alive is proof of my honesty, isn't it? He said. Joanna, fully dressed, had taken Duke's arm. I suppose I'm being a fool, said the reporter, whose eye was caught by the bloodstains on the curtains. To the airport in an old red Mercedes 190E. Duke and Joanna grabbed their belongings and hurried out the back door with their rescuers into the old car. Joanna and Duke were in the back seat. We are not being followed, the African man in the driver's seat said, looking into the rearview mirror. The blonde grumbled, I'd be lying if I said I was upset. Where did you find this piece of junk? He asked, eyeing the leaking car intently. There were 2 large pink dice hanging from the rearview mirror of the car. With a sigh, the blonde took them out and stuffed them into the glove compartment of the car. This is a classic, not a piece of junk, the African man said, snorting sarcastically. The blond man laughed with a brief sarcastic laugh. Classic? The Mercedes 300 SL is a classic. This 190E is just trash for taxi drivers. The African also laughed and said, you are so disrespectful. There is a design effort in this car, and now he too was starting to make fun of the subject. Who entered our room? Joanna asked in fear, clutching her bag to keep her hands from shaking. The blond man smiled and said, he was probably a hired killer. The black men consist of teams of 6. As their skills increase, their numbers decrease. We couldn't stop a black man who entered alone so easily. That's why they're called lone wolves. That's why he's a hired gun at best. But then he stopped, realizing that he had spoken too much with the hardening gaze of his African friend. What, a black man or something? Why would they send us hitmen? Joanna asked curiously. The blond man smiled, I'm sorry, miss, we can't talk about that. Our job is to get you out of the country safely. For now, dropping you off at the airport will be enough for your investigation, right? He said with a smile. The airport entrance was in sight. Yes, who cares about our research? Duke asked, his eyes narrowing at his smile. For the whole world, if you can, the African man said solemnly, adjusting his rearview mirror and looking at Duke. By this time they had arrived at the airport entrance. We have to leave you here, we have some secret friends inside. They will follow you to your plane. You will be safe, the blond man said. Duke just nodded and got out of the car. As they headed towards the airport entrance, Joanna asked him questions on her mind. What's going on? Who were these guys? Why did they want to kill us? Why did they save us? Duke sighed and looked at the young woman who was still shaking with fear. He hugged her and patted her head to calm her down. According to the wall clock he looked at as he entered the airport, the flight to Greece was still in 4 hours. July 30th, Tunisia, Mediterranean. Otto looked at the message he received. The 3-word message caused his eyebrows to furrow. Harper was exposed. He deleted the text message that read, John Harper had a critical mission. Otto was sure that the young man could finish this mission, but he still couldn't help but worry. Harper hit the small couch next to him with a blow to his chin, and the couch was shattered by the weight of the 6-foot-tall muscular man. His green t-shirt that clung to his body was torn apart by cuts from his chest, back, and stomach. His left eyebrow was open, and half of his face was covered in blood. The man who turned from where he had rolled and got up belonged to his Moorish opponent, who attacked him as if he were kicking the stool at his feet. The Moorish man got rid of the stool by bending backwards with the commando knives he held in both hands, as if he were a good capoeira, and without wasting time attacked John. First the right knife came with a stabbing motion to his face. Then the left one towards his chest. While John swung the right sideways, he pushed the left down and away. The Maghrebi was skilled, John was fast. Before the Maghrebi could make another cut, John's quick and light punch had exploded in the man's face. John, whose blue eyes were shining with anger under his thick eyebrows, was quickly backing away while blocking the stabs that were coming at him. John didn't want to kill the man. He had to find out who was holding him. When he finally came to the small table where he was having dinner, he threw a puddle of salt on a piece of newspaper into the Maghrebi's face. The dark-haired man, who was backing away with the salt in his eyes, kicked the library at the other end of the small and square-shaped hall with a kick that exploded in his chest, smashing it into the wall. John had rented this house when he first came to Tunisia. The previous owner of the house, which was in the attic of a 4-story building, was an academic at a university. The man, who was threatened by ISIS, had escaped to France with all the belongings he could take with him without pushing his luck. The house, which the man had worked so hard to furnish, had been left to the owner. Just as John was about to walk towards the Maghreb again, he heard a click coming from his door and took action. When the Maghreb got up again, shaking the books that had fallen on him, the man crossed his arms in front of him as a protective reflex when he saw that John Harper had thrown something towards him. However, this did not change his fate. Because the Zulu spear embedded in the man's chest nailed him to the wall behind him. At the same time, the door right next to him burst open. The man who entered was a tall and blond man like John. He was holding a Glock with a rectangular silencer in his hand. John quickly closed the gap and slapped the man's gun, turning its barrel away from him. At this moment, a metallic click was heard and a piece of the wall exploded and squirted out. The man had pulled the trigger with the blow he received. Harper's hand squeezed the gunman's wrist like a pair of pliers. While the man felt his muscles being crushed, John Harper made a fist with his other hand and hit the upper part of the hand holding the gun like a hammer. Harper, who caught the gun held by the hand that opened with the blow, turned the gun outwards and the man groaned as if he were screaming with his mouth closed. His index finger, which was caught in the trigger ring, was broken. Harper had seized the gun. He threw a thrusting kick into the chest of the man in front of him. He shot the man who was walking away once in the chest and twice in the head. At this moment, he saw the shadows of someone coming up the stairs and ran across the hall. When he reached the end of the hall, he grabbed his bag and jacket. While he was putting the bag on his back, the door was riddled with holes. The bullets that shattered the door were also shattering the ceiling and the opposite wall of the hall, covering the house with dust and shrapnel particles. Without hesitation, John ran towards the window next door and jumped with all his might. John, who came out of the window that broke into thousands of pieces with the pressure applied by his large body, heard the bullets tearing the air with the rage of a whip behind him and shattering the window frame. The young man fell from the window he came out of, drawing an arc at a slight angle and falling onto the balcony of the apartment building on the lower floor. Using his speed, the big man protected his head with his arms again and entered the house by breaking the balcony door. While everything in the house was torn apart by the fire opened from his own house, John started running by doing a somersault. He knew that those chasing him would not stop. When he reached the stairs, he heard the sounds of falling from inside the house and the scream of the landlady. His hunters were still after him. Without hesitation, he jumped again by stepping on the stair railing. He crossed the stairwell of the apartment building lengthwise and landed on the railing of the lower floor, and from there he pushed himself again and fell to the opposite side. The place he fell was facing the exit of the apartment building. As soon as he landed, the young man did a somersault to soften his fall and regain his balance, and when he shot off like an arrow, the place where he was standing was instantly shattered by bullets coming from above. Everything was happening so fast. When John reached the apartment exit, spent shell casings were just falling to the ground. A heavy shadow exploded on the cracked stone pavement where the shell casings fell, echoing and ringing, creating a crater. The big Nigerian, dressed in a black t-shirt and smoky pants, had skin as black as his soul. He had a silver piercing in his left eyebrow to contrast with this. He held an MP5K in each hand. He darted towards the door where John had run out. He had to catch him and take his bag. He would get a very good reward for this. Maybe he could even retire. When he went out into the street, he saw out of the corner of his eye that John had entered a side street that turned west. Most of the narrow streets were between the houses of this city that was over 1,000 years old. Unlike the new and modern cities of Europeans and Americans, the streets on this continent were shaped according to the houses. The man running in these historical streets bumped into a street vendor that came across him. While the warm cloths in the man's hand scattered on the street, the skinny man first hit the wall hard and then fell to the ground. The Nigerian man didn't even stop for him, he was just a predator locked on his target. When the side street he was walking on suddenly connected to a street, John slid over the car in his path and jumped over the barrels that were lined up in front of him and did a somersault. As he entered the next street, the hunter had come out from around the corner. He aimed his guns at John but didn't have time to shoot. When John saw that the street he entered was a dead end, he neither paused nor slowed down. He had lived in the ghettos of Paris for many years. The young man, who spent these years doing parkour with his peers, stepped on the side wall of the building that formed the street and the garden wall that blocked his path and quickly jumped forward. He took another step before reaching the top of the wall and pulled himself off the wall and jumped without thinking. He had landed on an old coal cellar in the backyard of a 2-story house. While the ceiling of the coal cellar groaned under John's weight, the young man quickly did another somersault in the air and landed on the ground and continued running. The man chasing him would enter a dead end in a few seconds, and when he could not find John, he would call for help from the satellite phone. John hurriedly left the garden of the house to the front and mingled with the crowd on the main street. The young man got into the first taxi he came across and handed the taxi driver $100 and told him he wanted to go to the airport. When the taxi pulled away, the young man saw the bullet hole in his bag. He opened his bag anxiously and checked the stone disc the size of a dinner plate. In the center of the crown disc was a hole the size of a coin, with small indentations and protrusions on the sides. Around this hole were carved many magical symbols and lines in a perfect circle. When John saw that the stone was undamaged, he smiled and released the breath he was holding, and collapsed into the seat of the taxi. The chase in Tunisia was over. He would be at the airport in an hour, flying to New York on a private jet. July 30th, upstate New York, USA. The weather was really hot. The Bombardier Global Express 9000, which landed at a private airport about 2 hours north of New York, parked in the large hangar indicated to him, then stopped its engines and opened its door. This was a precaution against images that could be captured by satellites and drones. He held his sweatshirt and camouflage jacket in his hands as he got off the private jet. He had an MP5K under his arm like a gun. Although 2 guards and 2 magicians got off before him and started checking the area, it didn't seem necessary. 3 black Dodge SUVs with black windows and a minivan were waiting for him. Each SUV had 2 guards at its head. They were all men in civilian clothes, wearing Kevlar assault vests. Most of the men, who were wearing loose-fitting pants with side pockets, were wearing baseball caps. They had pistols on their legs and M4s strapped to their chest straps. A brunette woman, dressed like the others, approached the aircraft ladder and smiled and said, "Welcome to the land of the free, Comandante." The tanned woman's tightly braided hair was as black as coal. Her eyes were lost behind mirrored Oakley sunglasses. Her full, shapely lips were halfway through a smile, and her shapely features were clearly visible even under her mercenary fatigues. Nodding to the woman, Polanov asked, "Natalia, is everything ready?" "The big boss says it's ready," Natalia Fernandez said, smiling as she invited him towards the SUV in the middle, but then she stopped talking, glaring at Nadia Perlanova as she got off the plane. "Oh my darling Natalia, I can see from your look that you haven't forgotten me," Nadia said smilingly. Natalia mumbled a long sentence, combining several swear words in Spanish, and Polanov wondered if some of these words could actually be said. Fernandez and Perlanova had spent the last 5 years waiting for the right opportunity to kill each other. But as long as it didn't come to a head, it didn't really concern Polanov. The man, who was walking casually toward his car, stopped as he was about to pass through the door that had been opened for him, and asked, "What about Kermensky?" Natalia nodded to him and they went to the minibus at the very back. In the luxurious seat of the armored minibus designed for VIP services, Professor Kermensky was sitting with 2 guards. The fat, messy-haired man, 6 feet tall, had round, rimless glasses and a beard that was 4 fingers long and had graying spots just like his hair. He was wearing a vest over his checkered shirt. He was sitting comfortably in his chair and had his legs crossed over his legs. He was holding a glass of whiskey that he had poured into a crystal glass. Polanov found this strange state of the scientist quite surprising. "Professor Kermensky, your reputation is spoken on all continents. It is an honor to meet you. I hope you are comfortable," Polanov said with a kindness that was not expected of him. "Forgive me for not saying the pleasure is mine. I'm a bit touchy about my freedom," the kidnapped scientist said, nodding to Polanov. "But you look quite relaxed," Polanov said critically, seeming to be quite amused. The chubby-faced man with bags and age lines under his green eyes, his lips curling, said, "Young man, I am 72 years old. I hope you don't mind if I spend my last few days, my last few hours, in comfort," he said, sipping the aged whiskey in his hand. "I'm not planning to kill you, Professor," Polanov said, smiling. "I don't plan on working for you either," Kermensky said, shrugging and looking into his glass. Polanov raised his index finger and winked. "This is where the magic comes in, Professor. The point is not for you to work with us anyway," he said, then looked at his guards, said, "The professor is our guest, he will not run away, but do not deprive him of his harmless pleasures," and closed the door. Fernandez was confused. Polanov never told him his full plans. "Aren't we going to use it?" he asked as he headed toward his car. "We use it," Polanov said with a half-smile. "Are we using it?" Fernandez asked, raising an eyebrow. "Oh yes, we do," Polanov said, smiling in a way he rarely does. July 31st, Athens, Greece. Eleni Maragos was an athletic woman, 5 feet 7 inches tall, who worked out regularly. Her short brown hair was combed to the side, as usual. Blue eyes behind small oval sunglasses were almond-shaped and had long eyelashes. She was a beautiful woman with a small, shaped nose and shapely lips. She wore beige safari shorts with side pockets, and a safari shirt over sandals. The broad-shouldered woman looked at her watch again, continuing to watch the entrance gate. The plane from Rome, Italy, had landed 20 minutes ago. The passengers had still not arrived at the exit. This was a common occurrence at Athens International Airport during the summer months. Still, the woman, in her 30s and looking nothing like her age, was very excited. She had not seen Perry for almost a decade. They had only followed each other through the news and rarely written to each other. Perry had called her early in the morning, just before his plane took off. Although Eleni had not heard from him for 10 years, she could tell the distress in Duke's voice. A big, suit-wearing security guard walked past the woman and looked at Eleni with a smile and asked, "Are they here yet?" A dark-skinned man with sharp features and a dimpled chin. Eleni shook her head smilingly. "No, Luca, I'm still waiting," she said smilingly. The black-haired, thick-browed, and kind-eyed man looked at the painting and said, "After Airnext drops off its New York passengers, Rome will arrive at gate 12. It's very crowded today, Eleni. I think you'll have to be patient." "I can wait while you're with me," Eleni said with a smile, adding a mysterious coquetry to her voice. "I was almost convinced, Eleni Maragos." "Of course I'll wait for you, but only if you have dinner with me tonight," Luca said, looking at the woman with wide eyes. "Luke, I would really like to have dinner with you, but I have guests and I need to spend time with them," Eleni said, pretending to be upset, while jutting her lips and playing with the man's jacket. "You are an incredible player, Eleni, and it is always a pleasure to play with you," Lucas said with a smile. It's because you see what I can do and imagine what I can do, Eleni said, squinting her eyes, curling up like a cat. Lucas swallowed hard as he fiddled with his radio, his pupils constricting and beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Fortunately, the passengers of the Rome flight appeared at the exit and saved the chief of security from Eleni's merciless clutches. Duke and Joanna had only taken a backpack with them when they set off. So they headed for the exit without waiting for their suitcases. Recognizing Duke at first sight, Eleni let out a short scream and ran to hug her old friend. Duke's smile was also sincere and warm. Joanna looked on with pure jealousy, but Eleni managed to pull herself together before turning to him. I missed you so much, American, Eleni said, holding Duke's face in her hands. I love you, Greek. This young lady is Joanna Swanson, Duke said, grinning. Hello Joanna, welcome to Athens. Let's get out of here quickly and you can tell me why you look so scary, Eleni said with a friendly smile. Only then did the Duke realize they looked like they had just escaped a disaster. Eleni was driving an old-fashioned, gray, dusty Honda Civic. It was her brother's legacy after he died in the 2014 protests. She couldn't get enough of the car, which kept breaking down. As they were leaving the airport, Eleni checked her rearview mirror and glanced at Duke. I've booked you a hotel for my cousin Andreas. It's clean and safe in the city center. So tell me, what's going on? She asked. Duke rolled down his window and adjusted his mirror so he could see beyond it. It's a long and complicated story, but in short, some mercenaries I met when I was reporting on Iraq got into big trouble. A few of them were working outside the country, and everyone else involved got killed, he said calmly, absently searching his pockets for a pack of cigarettes. Eleni opened the glove compartment and took out a Lucky Strike pack and gave it to Duke. Didn't anyone track down the murders? Duke asked, grinning as he opened the pack. Traffic accidents, heart attacks, gas explosions, Duke grumbled, shaking his head. Eleni whistled in a high-pitched tone, expensive business, so what were they chasing? We have no idea. The two of them first came to Rome and introduced themselves as documentarians, and asked an associate professor here about the First Crusades. According to the story, a military column came from here during the First Crusade and went to Anatolia by ship. They came here after talking to that woman, and according to Coleman, one of them returned to America from here, and the other never left the country, he said, taking a deep breath from his cigarette. Is Coleman still alive? There are those who actually believe that man was a CIA agent, Eleni said cheerfully. I believe there is a superhuman network, Duke muttered, nodding. End of chapter 2.